Why are Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and the statist mainstream press so silent about the drug war, one of the burning issues of our time? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. We've been doing this for 34 years now, principled and compromising cases for libertarian positions. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who was with me 34 years ago when we started this foundation. And Richard, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, and of course to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, Richard is professor of economics at the Citadel, the BB&T professor, distinguished professor of ethics and free enterprise, something like
Leadership.
that, leadership, and former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and former Ludwig von Mises professor of economics at Hillsdale College, and former professor of economics, or former a professor of economics there at University of Dallas, where we first met.
Yes.
So, Richard, one of the issues that you and I have been talking about essentially from the first time we met back in the 1980s, but certainly that we've been discussing here at FFF from our very first year. I think it was the April issue of our monthly journal, which is now called Future of Freedom, that we addressed it. But an issue that you don't see being addressed in the presidential race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is the drug war. And this to me is
Yes.
phenomenal. Now, I didn't watch the entire debate, fell asleep, but I don't think they discussed the drug war. Certainly, it's not something important to the moderators, the debate moderators. You don't see it being discussed either among Democrats or Republican commentators in the mainstream press. Yet this is a major issue in our lives. We've all been
Yes.
born and raised into this issue. It has brought death, destruction, violence. It's costing out untold amounts of money, and nothing ever changes. I mean, you see these massive drug busts, record drug busts, record drug busts. And I just saw an article today where the new head of the Drug Enforcement Administration says, well, fentanyl's the new threat to America and we need to do something. Well, they've all been big threats to America all of our lives, and yet no mention of this issue at all. Why? Well, I think it's because they're all on the same page on it. They all favor this program. They don't have any objections to it. And so why bring up an issue like what's your position on the drug war? What are you going to do about the drug war? Because both the Democrats and the Republicans and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are essentially on the same page. All statists are on the same page on this issue, and which has been a disaster. And then, of course, there's the moral cases. What business does government have punishing people for ingesting an unapproved substance? But I mean, have you noticed this dearth of conversation here among among these candidates and among the statist press on this issue?
Well, I haven't heard anything either. The only time it tangentially arises is in the issue about border control. Particularly, Trump will emphasize that these are all, gangs that are connected to the drug industry, and that's another reason why to have up a supposedly an impenetrable wall. But the basic problem is that both the Republicans and Democrats, given their inherent political paternalistic tendencies, though of course their rationales are often different, the focus can be are directed towards different aspects of our lives, basically believe that the government knows best as to what you should be ingesting into your body, both because they deem that the harm is not just to others, but also to yourself. And the government's responsible is to see that you are kept in a virtuous form of conduct to keep yourself sound and well. And, this argument is not new. The great episode of this, of course, was prohibition. An amendment was passed to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. It was finally repealed by another amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1933. But for that 13-year period, we had gone through a hyper-vigilant version on alcohol, the war on drugs. And it was a disaster. It created a huge black market, bootlegging with the bringing in of drugs across the Canadian border, the Mexican border, or along the eastern seaboard from places like Cuba into various aspects of the Gulf of Mexico or the Western Atlantic along the south. Notoriously, supposedly, John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, had made some of his money in the bootlegging business. At least that's what I've heard or read. But the fact is that all it did was generate this huge disrespect for the law, partly because, and it's the same thing with drugs. People would say, of course, drinking can be to excess, and we see that it ruins people's lives. But I'm just a social drinker. What's wrong with coming home after a hard day at the office or the job site and having a beer or a glass of wine? You know, those laws are good for the other people, but I can handle alcohol. Right? It's not a problem for me. So what if I get a case of booze off the back of some truck in a dark alley, or I go to a speakeasy with my friends, the illegal nightclubs with alcohol, down the back alley, and you knock on the little trap door and you say, "Joe sent me," and you go in and have a good night with your friends at this illegal bar. And all it did was create this vast network of government bureaucracy, violation of people's rights, breaking into homes, surveilling and intruding in the ways that they had the technological ability to do then. And it was lost because by the early 1930s, it was clear that this was so counterproductive and so much against the attitude of so many people that it was not worth putting up with. The gang violence, the street gang wars, the innocent victims and bystanders, the violation of people's basic personal and property rights, the corruption of the legal system, the bribery of judges or blackmailing of judges and district attorneys, the fact that bootleg kingpins would still operate their businesses from their prison cells. So it was just decided that this had to end. And the interesting thing is that virtually the day after the Prohibition Amendment was repealed, alcohol was then available again in stores, available in bars and saloons, restaurants, and the crime for that action virtually disappeared. Why were you fighting over turf when it was no longer a black market product? Why were you killing people when it's something that could be bought over the counter? So this is just a repeat of this, but which has actually been going on even longer, because the fact is that these laws against the narcotics emerged very shortly after the establishment of the Pure Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, in 1914, with the idea that it is the government's responsibility to keep and maintain the health of the population and to keep bad things out of people's hands. And the little kids, always the little kids. The same thing was done without alcohol, saving the little kids from the bad examples. And all we see is the gangs, the corruption, the violence, the disruption of people's lives for the use or possession of one drug or after another, prison sentences, having that record hanging over your head for the rest of your life and making it difficult for you to get on with your life after, quote, you experimented a little bit as a young kid in high school or college. This has been a total disaster, but it all comes from that premise. Besides these consequentialist effects that would itself, in a cost-benefit analysis, make us doubt the efficacy or the workability of it, just like with alcohol prohibition, is the fact that it undermines and challenges and impugns the very presumption of what a free society is based upon, which you were alluding to, Jacob. And that is, what business is it of the government to be telling people what they can ingest in their own body? The fact is that this is your most personal, private property, right? You own yourself. You can decide what to read. You can decide what faith to hold in your mind in terms of a religious faith or not. You have the ability to decide whether you want to exercise and keep in shape or not. Well, it's up to the individual to decide whether he wants to ingest various chemical substances, which others may very well and sincerely and even correctly tell him can be detrimental to their long-run well-being. But it is the right of the individual. Just like if he doesn't want to eat right, he wants to stuff his face with candy and become obese, or never go out and exercise the way he did just to keep a certain physical well-being. You are a free person. You're supposed to be living in a free society in which the only means of changing people's behavior is reason, argumentation, and the example of your own life or others to try to wean a person off the wrong path if that's what you see him having gone. But to have a continuation of this, unending like this, just is a road that has no end. There is no light at the end of this tunnel other than more violence, more corruption, more harm, more deaths, and more ruining of people's lives. And I'll just mention one other thing. People like, but these drugs kill people, and they can. Just like if you drink too much to excess, you can destroy your liver. But most of these problems, as in fact during the bootlegging period, was the impurities in the making of the alcohol and the impurities of the making and then the use of these drugs. And that's because how do you get any guarantee from a reputable above board supplier that this is the quality of the product? And it's not. He's legally liable. Who do you take to court? Which cartel do you take to court if some member of your family dies because of an impurity in the narcotic or the paraphernalia that he's been provided for to use it? This just exacerbates the problem. What's important is just to leave this in the hands of people themselves and to realize that one of the costs of a free society is to realize that others will do things that you don't approve of or yet you dislike or you think harms them. But again, I'll just reiterate, the free person in a free society accepts the fact that the way you change others' behavior, if you think that you know a better way than they do, is reason, persuasion, and example. That is voluntarism, not compulsion.
Yeah, well, you've raised a lot of good points. You know, you're on your point that the government is trying to keep you a healthy person. They see that as a role of government to keep the society healthy. And if you don't do what they say that it's needed to keep you healthy, they prosecute you and put you in jail until you get your mind straight and you figure out, hey, this isn't healthy for me. But in a larger context, Richard, it's really how they see the individual. They see the individual as just one part of the great society. And their job is to keep society healthy. Because we're not really individuals in the minds of the collectivists, that we're just cogs in their giant machine. It's like a beehive. We're all little drones in their beehive. And so when they're trying to keep us healthy, it's in order to keep the hive healthy, that the hive becomes more productive, that we can beat the Chinese better on producing better things and more things, more automobiles. But if our society is tripping out on drugs, that makes society less productive. And so it's this collective mindset that sees us as just part of this great big machine called the Great Society. Your point about prohibition is very interesting too, because back then they understood what the Constitution was. It set up a government of limited powers. And so it's interesting that they recognized that there was no constitutional authority for government to punish people for ingesting alcohol. They had to amend the Constitution to destroy liberty, because they knew that the framers had called into existence a government of limited powers. And among those limited powers was not to punish people for ingesting harmful substances. There's been harmful substances probably since the beginning of civilization. Certainly there was alcohol when the country was founded. So the framers didn't put that in there, that we're going to punish people for ingesting alcohol, but they understood they had to get a constitutional amendment, and then they had to repeal it when they realized what a disaster it was in terms of what you described, the violence, the Al Capone era, the machine gunnings, and all the things that comes with either alcohol prohibition or drug prohibition. But on drugs, they didn't do that, Richard. They had entered an era where the Constitution was irrelevant at this point. You see that in other areas like the declaration of war requirement. Everybody knows that the government can't go to war without a declaration of war. That's the Constitution. Yet it's that provision is ignored with impunity. Nobody cares. And certainly the Supreme Court doesn't care. Well, it's the same with drug laws. How come they didn't get a constitutional amendment permitting them to establish drug laws like with alcohol laws? Because by that time, the Constitution was irrelevant. And let's not forget, this thing goes back a long ways. I mean, I forget when the first Narcotics Act was passed, but it's like the early part of the 20th century. And remember, they were going after Billie Holiday with a vengeance, going after her because she was addicted to drugs, and this was their way to get her. And they got her. And it's been going on ever since. And I consider the drug war the most racist government program since segregation, because even though they apply it against people of all colors, there is no question that they apply it disproportionately against blacks. That you can see the sentencing is against blacks, the asset forfeiture. It's a nice little excuse to steal money from people on the highway. But they usually stop people that they perceive as lower middle class or lower economic classes. They don't have the money to fight back. And the stops, the searches, and the seizures, and the humiliation, and it's the perfect opportunity. If you're a bigot, I'm not saying that all cops are bigots, but what I'm saying is this program does attract bigots into it, because it's the one program where you can exercise your bigotry legally and get praised for it. You know, when a judge sends a black guy up to the penitentiary for 30 years because he possessed some quantity of marijuana or cocaine, you know, he gets praised for it at his dinner parties. Oh, thank you for support, you know, helping us keep America drug free. Well, it's not drug free. We all know this. The drug war has failed to achieve its purported end. It is an absolute total disaster, but it's not neutral. As you point out, it has come with violence and cartels and so forth. And what's fascinating to me, though, Richard, is they still think they're going to win it. This is like a forever program. As you and I have argued over the years, there's one quick way to get rid of the cartels, which would get rid of them immediately. All the drug dealers, the illicit drug dealers, just legalize drugs. Get rid of this program. They're all put out of business immediately. So if that's what your goal is, to get rid of these violent sectors of society, that's the way to do it. If you do it the other way, like they've been doing it for 70, 80 years, I don't know, 100 years, you get the opposite. And I sometimes sit here and say, how can they not see this? Well, I think they do see it. I think a lot of them see it, but it's their jobs. You know, you got federal judges that their dockets are filled with drug cases. They would be twiddling their thumbs and reading magazines if they didn't have the drug war. Prosecutors, the same thing. Clerks. It's a big drug war bureaucracy. This is about their jobs. And then finally, let me just make one more point here. A lot of these artificial drugs, the ones that are man-made, are come into existence because of the drug war. They make the regular drugs so expensive that the drug producers are trying to figure out, okay, how can we come up with something that's cheaper and easier to transport? Milton Friedman made this point many, many years ago, many, many decades ago, where he pointed out that crack cocaine was a direct response to the exorbitant black market prices of cocaine. And then when blacks started buying the crack cocaine because it was much cheaper, blacks in the inner city couldn't afford the regular cocaine, they started meting out disproportionately higher sentences to them, again, confirming the racially bigoted aspects of this war.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on this this idea of, what motivates the enforcers of this. And as some of the listeners may know, is that one of the subdivisions of economics as a field discipline is what is called public choice theory. And public choice theory attempts to apply the same principles and logic of economics about the marketplace to the political arena. And rather than assuming that those in the bureaucracy and the political leaderships are people of benevolence who only care about their fellow man, ethical eunuchs, altruistic do-gooders alone, the fact is they have self-interests. They have vested interests. And whatever may have motivated the people who first set up these agencies, once they're in place, you then have a vested interest in the continuation of the programs. It is your rice bowl. Are you going to go up to some congressional committee when it is budgetary time, if you're involved in one of these anti-narcotic agencies, anti-drug agencies, and say, you know, so we've looked over our track record and it's been abysmal. And obviously, senator or congressman, the only thing that can be done is for you to repeal these laws and to cut our budgets, and we'll go look for an honest job in the private sector. No, there's no interest and motive to do that. In other words, growing budgets, more authority is the means by which, by expanding the bureaucracy, you create positions of promotion, greater authority and control, and a sense of you being in charge. It's basically a rice bowl. It's a trough from which you eat. So you have the DEA, you have the FBI, you have the courts and the judicial system and the legal structure, as you were suggesting, and then there are all the people who supply the equipment and the means by which these agencies operate. Think of the firearms. Think of the surveillance equipment. Think of all of the other little minor things that are purchased by these government agencies that is sources of their revenue, which is dependent upon the continuation of government spendings in those directions. All of these indirect spider's web of vested interests whose financial well-being and employment are derived from a continuation, if not an expansion, of these anti-drug war programs. And as a consequence of this, this makes it extremely difficult to break, because then people are doing everything in their power to see that they're not reversed or repealed, because then you have the problem is, oh, well, where do I get my next job? Now that sounds like you know, so almost a cliche, but it is absolutely true. The more you have legislation like this, the more you create vested interests who, like a spider's web, will have increased motives and intentions and needs to preserve it tooth and nail.
That's a great point, because you can always see the direct consequences, the salaries of the federal judges, the salaries of the prosecutors, the court clerks, the DEA agents, deputy sheriffs. But what you're pointing out is what is unseen, the whole complex of things that are indirectly dependent on this, and therefore have an interest in keeping it going regardless of the results. It's sort of like the military industrial complex. You can see the soldiers getting their salaries, but all the so-called defense contractors and all the cities that are dependent on their military bases and terrified of losing their military bases, the restaurants, the bars, and so forth, can be called the drug war complex. That's got to be huge. Which gets us back to, Richard, then, how come intelligent people like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris can't see this? It's phenomenally. Trump says, oh, he wants to drain the swamp and get rid of the deep state. And here's this gigantic part of the swamp. I mean, I don't know what he refers to as swamp, but what redeeming qualities does this program have? I don't see any. I see federal judges repeating the same mantras that they repeated 40 years ago when I was practicing law on the border. I mean, it's just a repeat of, oh, well, I got to give you a big sentence here we got to crack down and win the war on drugs. This is what federal judges were saying back 40 years ago. The same mantras. They just copy what judges and prosecutors were doing 40 years ago, especially there on the border. Nothing's ever changed. And yet they continue doing it. Kamala Harris was a prosecutor there in California. She was putting people away for these drug offenses. How come these people can't say it? See it. Trump is talking about bombing Mexico, that, boy, he's going to really teach these people a lesson. Can you imagine dropping bombs in a foreign country? I mean, it's just, well, of course they do it as a matter of course, but to enforce the drug war, it's absolutely incredible, Richard.
See, I think the part that human beings have a great capacity to rationalize things that serve their own interests. And the fact is, you're thinking, well, how does Donald Trump not see this, or Kamala Harris? And of course, you're saying intelligent people. I think it's a little bit of an oxymoron when you put the words Harris and Trump with intelligent people, but we'll put that aside for a minute. I know I'm so bad, but how insensitive, hurtful. I'm so hurtful to others. Um, but I think what we need to not forget the fact, people's capacity to rationalize things that are in their own interest. It's sort of like the person who goes to the government and asks for an import duty on a foreign competitor, who's able to produce and then transport to the United States a product and still sell it for less than the American domestic rival. And the American producer is concerned about losing market share and profitability to this competitor who just happens to be on the other side of a political borderline on a map. And he's, but it's not just from, for me as the owner of the company, it's my employees. And it's an industry essential to American well-being, or as they now say, national security. It's for the good of the country. Yes, you're using all of these platitudes and cliches about altruism and goodness and the general welfare to basically justify what ends up being an act that protects you from the competition of the marketplace. It's all of these things about, but we have to put them behind bars. We have to keep America out of the hands of the drug dealers and this, that, and the other. These are basically the other smoke screens of in a different direction of the same things that justify the continuation of the programs and the employment in them and the salaries that come from them and all of the indirect industries and sectors of the economy that feed off the expenditures that are supplying the means by which these direct agencies go about the anti-drug war business.
Yeah, and I also like to just emphasize this idea that government sees a social problem, and they seize upon that social problem as a way to expand their control over the citizenry. I mean, like alcoholism. There was an alcoholic problem in the late 1800s that you had the Anti-Temperance League or the Temperance League, whatever it was called, to deal with alcoholism in society. Were there people taking drugs, mind-altering drugs into the 20th century? Of course. There's always been this, any kind of social problem. What government does is it seizes on this. Is okay, well, now we're gonna pass these laws and we're gonna clean things up. Well, they don't clean things up. But, they're making a big deal that, fentanyl is this the worst problem we've ever had. If you go back to the 1950s, there were housewives taking sedatives. And that was the big crisis of that time. Oh my gosh, all these housewives are addicted to these sedatives and so forth. Well, leave social problems where they belong, in the private sector. That's what Alcoholics Anonymous or drug rehab centers. Government has no role in this. Government's role is to punish violent criminals, murderers, rapists, thieves, and so forth. And when we let government cross the line into dealing with these social problems, we lose our liberty. And at the same time, we end up with a violent, cartel-driven society that's very, very unattractive for everybody.
Well, I think that since you raised it, this addiction, the greatest addiction in our society today is the people who are hooked on government solutions to their social problems. I can't get by without my subsidy. I can't get by without my trade protection. I can't get by without my income redistribution. I can't get by unless government makes other people conform to the standards that I think they should live by. I can't get over my fix on the government solving all of my social problems. Don't take the government program, redistributive program needle away from me. No, I'll go into withdrawals.
Well, so do you think we should use government to go after the people who are addicted to government programs?
That would be the most bizarre extension of the program. The thinking that is imaginable. Talk about Orwellian. That be sort of like another twist on 1984.
All right. On that eloquent, insightful note, we will wrap things up. Richard, enjoyed the conversation as always. Look forward to talking to you next week. And thank y'all for tuning in.
Until next time.